I'd wondered before if the mechanic hadn't always been a hunter. When he'd forced those memories into my head, I'd felt what he'd felt. When he laid eyes on the white sun of mist, there had been admiration and lust. Lust not just for his new king, but for blood. He'd gladly abandoned whatever life had held for him before in order to become a wild huntsman. I hadn't even considered the possibility that he could, and would even want to make me experience his memories. If I'd known that that was a possibility, I would have included that in the conditions. Afterwards, I felt like I'd been tainted. Like if I wasn't careful, his malice was a cancer that would grow until it consumed me from the inside out. I don't know if that would actually happen, but after getting a glimpse into the mechanic's psyche, I understand him a little too well now. Way more than I ever wanted to. And that had to have been why he'd given me the hint that way. He'd known that brief window into his mind would be enough to disturb me. I assumed that when he dug through my memories at Dylan's, he'd emotionally relived them just as I did. If that's the case, then I hope he'd found something in me to be as much of a poison to him as his malice was for me. Whether it's rational or not, I'm afraid to linger on the mechanic's cruelty for too long. I just need to stay focused on what helps. Something that I consider to be both good news and bad news is that I at least know for sure that I am not dealing with the king of the wild hunt, Gwynethnud himself. Though that comfort doesn't mean much, since I'd still have to figure out who the hell the mechanic is. The church was the most useful memory. A ruined stone building surrounded by black water, partially flooded. The reason why it had seemed so familiar to me was because of an urban legend regarding one of the lakes in the neighboring county. According to this legend, there used to be a town there back when Pennsylvania was first ratified. The devil came to this town impersonating a priest, leading the townspeople into wickedness. It started with the devil replacing the communal wine with whiskey, encouraging the townspeople to spend their days intoxicated instead of honoring the good book. The devil then taught the townspeople witchcraft, convincing them that the dark arts he introduced them to were simply manifestations of the Lord's power. Assuming that this is all true, that church sounded like an absolute blast. Witchcraft and booze? Sign me up. However, God didn't see things that way and punished the townspeople for allowing themselves to be misled into temptation and blasphemy, causing black water to bubble up from beneath the church, submerging the entire town until it was wiped off the map completely. As far as urban legends go, it's an odd one, and definitely a product of religious fear-mongering. For the longest time, I didn't believe it simply because there was no record of a town having ever been there. However, those who live near the area insist that a ruined stone church resurfaces every full moon, and with the church's arrival, demons apparently follow. Now, the thing is, I don't think that this church is from our world. I think it's from theirs. And that might be why there's no record of it. If the urban legend turns out to be true, then this might be the church I'm looking for. The only problem is that the next full moon won't be until the end of the month. This unfortunately gives you-know-who plenty of time to raise hell before I can even attempt to find the ledger. So yins might be wondering about what exactly one does in my position. I worked. Bills have to be paid, and I doubt my landlord would accept I am being hunted for sport by a psychopomp as an excuse for any late payments. Until that church appeared, there wasn't much I could really do. When one of our clients called, he sounded embarrassed.
Hey, so, I'm so sorry, this probably sounds ridiculous, but my son thinks there's a monster under his bed, and I mean, no matter how many times I assure him that there's nothing there, he wakes up in the middle of the night and he's just, terrified. I know it's kind of silly, but if you have time, could you pretend like you found a monster and caught it, so both of us can get some sleep at night?
Huh. Okay. I told him I could, but internally decided that I wanted to get the kid side of the story as well. On a surface level, it sounded like the product of a little kid's overactive imagination, but for whatever reason, kids can see things that adults can't. It wouldn't take too much extra time to be certain that there truly wasn't anything there. Just as a disclaimer, I want to make it known that not everything that a kid sees is actually anything atypical. Sometimes it really is just them being afraid of the dark. Although given my line of work, I'd say that's a perfectly reasonable fear. The client then started to distantly talk about how his wife had been better at comforting their son than he had. They'd lost her while she was giving birth to what should have been their daughter, but ended up being a stillborn. That was only 2 weeks before he called Orion. Truthfully, I'd never known how to react when clients dumped such tragic admissions on me. I offered my condolences, but it seemed so contrived, at least to me.
I still just, can't believe she's gone.
He said softly.
Maybe that's why he's seeing monsters? Maybe it's a grief thing.
Again, I didn't know what to say, but I made sure to sound as comforting as possible.
Yeah, it could be. I'm not exactly qualified to say, since I'm not that well versed in child psychology. I'll do what I can, okay?
The client thanked me for agreeing to help out, and then he thanked me again for letting him talk, saying that he had a hard time getting himself to speak to anyone since the funeral. Poor guy. I also made a mental note to sneak some salt along the client's west-facing windows. The mechanic would have a field day with someone as grief-stricken as him. And when I got there, the client tried to smile as he let me in. He introduced me to his son, telling me that he'd be 5 this month. Though that solemn look on the little boy's face made him appear older. That loss, understandably, was weighing heavily on him too. I asked the client if I could have a moment to talk to the boy alone, and he nodded, disappearing into the hall. The first words out of the son's mouth were, "He doesn't believe me. You won't either." Well, I assured him, "I've seen a lot of things that people don't believe in, so why don't you tell me about your monster? I might be able to get rid of it for you." The kid looked down, frowning. "It's not there now. It only comes out at night." "How long has this been going on?" "Since Mama died and my little sister went to heaven." The kid said this so plainly while looking unsure, like he understood that his mother was gone, but not why. It can be difficult enough for adults to process loss, so I can't imagine how much harder it must be for a 4-year-old. "Can you show me where you saw the monster at least?" I asked, followed by explaining. "Well, some monsters are really good hiders, but they do leave things behind that I can use to find them." The kid guided me to his bedroom, standing in the hall as he skeptically stared at his bed, adorned with Sonic the Hedgehog bedspread. My hagstone vibrated, and there was something here. I checked under the bed. Nothing. Not even a rogue sock. The boy looked hopeless, and the hagstone didn't stop. "What does the monster look like?" I asked gently. He looked surprised that I was still taking his concerns seriously. She looks like an old lady with bird feet and a beak. I can see her eyes glowing in the dark." That description rang a bell. An unfortunate bell, too. "Did she hurt you?" The boy looked down, beginning to cry. "Daddy says they're just bad dreams, but when I wake up, the monster is there." Instantly, I comforted the kid, promising him that I would get rid of it. His description, combined with the fact that the family had just endured a stillborn, meant that it could only be one thing: a dreamer. Like housekeepers, the dreamers have been known to worm their way into human dwellings. But at least the housekeepers have the courtesy to do some chores after making themselves at home. As their title implies, the dreamers have been known to disturb a household's sleep by inducing vivid nightmares to anyone unfortunate enough to catch its attention, sometimes even inducing sleep paralysis. Some of our records state that dreamers are the disquieted spirits of stillborns and miscarried infants, bitterly watching their relatives live on while they never had the chance to even draw their first breath. During the day, they tend to hide under beds and in closets and behind heaters. So if one of your kids reports a monster in their bedroom, like the client's son did, just know that a nightlight won't cut it. When I told the kid, I gave him the G-rated version. That it was a monster that likes to scare kids, but it could be scared too. And wouldn't it only be fair to frighten the monster right back? The tears stopped as the kids considered, eventually sniffling. What's the monster afraid of? Food. The kid wrinkled his nose. Really? They sure are. They give you nightmares so that they can feed off of your dreams. Real food terrifies them because it's not a dream and they don't know how to eat it. The kid pondered this and then eventually nodded. That makes sense. The truth is that dreamers may eventually leave if they're given offerings, normally in the form of desserts. I didn't trust that a 4-year-old would remember to take something fresh out from under his bed, so I slipped some candy under there. That being said, dreamers can be stubborn. Sometimes offerings don't cut it. In cases like that, it can be difficult for a regular person to get a dreamer out of their home. I remember hoping that this wouldn't be one of those cases. Once I had a moment, I salted the house's windows as I'd considered doing earlier. And this kid didn't need to lose his mother and his father. And in turn, the client definitely didn't deserve to end up at the mercy of the mechanic and his ilk. I did inform the client of my dreamer treatment plan, explaining that I got his son to believe that candy was the dreamer's kryptonite. I then told him that if it doesn't work, to call me back. He seemed confused, but otherwise went for it. I think he was just willing to do anything to help his kid get a good night's sleep, even if he didn't believe that there was anything sinister going on. Well, the next day, I got a call back. It was going to be a bad dreamer case after all. The candy offering had made the dreamer move on from harassing the boy to pestering his father. The client shakily informed me,
You're probably going to think I'm crazy, but I mean, hell, I feel crazy. I had this so horrible nightmare about Linda. I can't even say it. It's not important, but I woke up and I couldn't breathe or move, and
I got the client calmed down and assured him that I could come by after hours to deal with the pest when it was active, as long as he was comfortable with that. He just wanted the dreamer out. While I know that going out at night when the hunt is most active is risky, I had promised the mechanic to make things exciting. If he got bored or otherwise felt that I wasn't holding up my end of the bargain, he'd have no reason to hold up his end. The deal would be off and I'd go right back to square one. I was just going to have to pray that he wouldn't pick that night in particular to continue the breaking down process with me. But back to the dreamer. When offerings don't work, the dreamer will have to be captured, which can be achieved through stealth, planning, and an empty bottle. Any bottle will do, no matter the material or the capacity. I pretended to sleep on the couch, knowing that the dreamer wouldn't feel emboldened enough to come out unless it thought that nobody would be able to interrupt its nighttime activities. I'd left my hagstone hanging on the front doorknob, partially to discourage any interference from certain outside parties, and partially to ensure that it wouldn't ruin everything by alerting the dreamer to my presence. A few hours passed. Claws clicked on the wooden floor, but I didn't move. I had to wait until the dreamer started to attack the client. And that's when it would be the most vulnerable. The dreamer's claws tapped their way down the hall, past where I laid in the living room, pausing near me. It wheezed as it got close to me. Even though I didn't dare even peek through my eyelashes, I knew that a dreamer's nose was close to mine. I could feel it. It took effort to keep my breathing in the same gentle pattern as it would be if I were in the midst of a peaceful dream. And to my relief, the dreamer's claws eventually tapped away, heading toward the client's room. His door creaked open, and I waited until I heard the client let out a soft groan. And slowly, quietly, I crept to the bedroom, empty Fiji water bottle in hand. Thankfully, the house was a fairly new construct, complete with that awful modern farmhouse aesthetic, so it didn't creak much. As an aside, trying to do this in older homes can be a bit of a pain in the ass. Peering through the open bedroom door, I found the dreamer kneeling on top of the client's chest. Her hair was gnarled as if old straw were growing out of her scalp, Her black beak was partially open, set beneath a pair of gleaming white eyes, and like the boy had said, her legs resembled that of a chicken. The client whimpered, his head turning in his sleep with a grimace. I already had the bottle open and the cap in my hand as I snuck closer to the dreamer. She was invested in whatever she was making the client see, her beak clicking subtly as if she were speaking. Once she was within my reach, I swung the bottle in a wide arc, causing the dreamer to dissipate into black smoke. She let out an outraged cry that was cut off abruptly as I screwed the cap on. The client woke up with a jolt, looking around in alarm until his eyes locked onto me. It abruptly wasn't the most comforting sight as I stood at the edge of his bed holding a Fiji bottle full of turbulent black smoke like the world's strangest sleep paralysis demon. As he slowly realized that he was safe in his bedroom instead of wherever he'd been in his nightmare, he visibly relaxed, covering his face with his hands. The commotion had woken up a little boy who stood in the hall, sleepily rubbing his eyes. The client leapt out of bed and scooped him up, assuring him that everything was okay. The boy looked at me groggily. "Did you get the monster?" I held up the bottle so he could see, and the boy smiled, muttering that the bottle was cool, before conking out on his father's shoulder. Eyeballing the smoky bottle, the client whispered, "That's it?" I nodded, quietly telling him that I was going to release it far away where it couldn't return, but just in case, put tape over every keyhole in the house to prevent any possibility of it getting inside again. Dreamers drift in through keyholes and doors exclusively, and they'll ignore an open window or chimneys and any other opening into homes. Though we're not sure why, but it makes preventing them easier, at least. I retrieved my hagstone, placing it back around my neck before I left with the smoky bottle in hand. Little taps shook my hand as the dreamer struggled in its tropical-themed prison. Once I got outside, I warily looked around. No sign of anything. Well, not yet, at least. I hurried to the G6, knowing that I'd feel safer once my shotgun was within my reach again. On my way to the spot I intended to release the dreamer at, she yelled at me, her voice muffled by the bottle. "I can't hear you in there."
"Not fair."
"We can talk about it when we get to where we're going." "I'm not letting you out in the car." The dreamer let out a grumble, but the complaint stopped. Once I parked and determined that I was alone as I could be in the neighbor-infested forest, I untwisted the cap from the bottle. Black smoke flowed out, taking the shape of a bird-like figure. The dreamer initially tried to charge me, but couldn't breach the limits of the hagstone. She let out a growl of frustration and then scowled at me, eyes glowing from beneath the sagging brows. I calmly asked the dreamer what she wanted to tell me. The dreamer yelled,
"This isn't fair, you know. He gets to feel the sun on his skin, have breath in his lungs, and be held in loving arms, and what about me?"
I hope that I said the right things. You're right. It's not fair, but that's not anyone's fault. I guarantee if there was a way for your father to bring you and your mother back, he would. Both he and your brother wanted to know you so badly. The dreamer grumbled.
"It does not seem like it. The funeral happened, and that was that."
Trying to keep my tone gentle, I replied, "What else are they supposed to do? They're in pain too, and they're just trying to figure out where to go from here. You need to do the same." The dreamer's scowl began to shift into a lost, forlorn expression.
"What do you mean?"
Your opportunity to be human was taken from you, but you still have a chance to live. It's not going to be what you wanted necessarily, but it's something. Yeah, you may not have the sun, but the moon and the stars are all yours. I never knew if the things I say help. The dreamer said nothing as she disappeared into the trees, and she hasn't bothered the family since. I genuinely hope that she and the rest of the family are able to find peace. A few days passed before I encountered anything else atypical. While I wasn't exactly in a hurry to see the mechanic again, his absence made me paranoid. I had to drive past his shop on the way to a call and noticed that his truck wasn't there. And for whatever reason, that gave me a bad feeling. When I asked Victor about it, he wasn't able to tell me anything other than that the mechanic was out of town. That evening, I heard a woman's song floating from the trees in the direction of the river. She had the type of voice that was so enchanting that it made the hairs on the skin stand up. The kind of voice that made you stop whatever it was you were doing to hang on to each word. The kind that haunted you long after their song ended, desperate to hear them sing again. There was no reaction from my hagstone. Whatever she was, she didn't mean me harm. Despite that, I was still on edge as I followed her voice. I found her solemnly scrubbing a red stain in a white shirt as each word left her mouth. I saw that the singer had wet blonde hair that was even lighter than mine, almost white, clinging to her soaked scalp and shoulders. Her nose and eyes were tinged an irritated shade of pink. A weeper. While weepers generally aren't dangerous on their own, those neighbors only appear when death is coming for someone in your family. Though they can get violent if provoked. Seeing her made my heart rate quicken as I wondered who her song was about. I approached her slowly, noticing that her knuckles were a bright pink as if she'd been scrubbing for hours. She trailed off, her melody devolving into choking sobs. The weeper raised her head, big blue eyes, bloodshot and gleaming with tears, her white eyelashes clinging together, and she sniffled, swallowing back another sob. Admittedly, I was not afraid. Not of the weeper, but for whoever's shirt she held. Please don't let it be my mom's. Struggling to keep a tremor out of my voice, I asked, "Who are you grieving for?" The weeper's lower lip quaked, and she bit it, looking down regretfully as she let the shirt drift out of her hand, the river's current bringing it right to me. I reached down to pick it up, examining it for any sort of defining characteristics. It looked vaguely familiar, but I was relieved to see that it didn't belong to my mother. Not only was it far too big for her, but there was a small coffee stain on the collar. Mom hates coffee. My grandma had already passed 5 years ago, and may she rest in peace. I'd never met my grandfather, and I have no contact with my father's side of the family. Hold on. I tried to recall what kind of clothes my father had worn before he was incarcerated. I couldn't. I'd visited him twice in my life and only remembered ever seeing him in that gray uniform all the inmates are issued. The shirt looked big enough to fit him. If you're able to capture a weeper, they will tell you the name of the person fated to die. However, this one didn't seem inclined to run. She gazed mournfully at me as the water swirled around her, waiting. "It's my father, isn't it?" I asked numbly. The weeper nodded gravely. It didn't seem real. I knew that weepers were incredibly accurate when it came to their sense of impending death, but it didn't make sense. There was some part of me that always believed that it was impossible for someone like the sperm donor to die. Shouldn't I have been afraid or sad? Maybe if I'd had a normal father. Whatever it was that I was supposed to feel, I simply couldn't. Despite the messiness of my thoughts, I told the weeper, "I appreciate your song." The weeper offered a sad smile. "You would be the first." I told her that her voice was beautiful and I meant it. Before I left, she asked me something that surprised me. "Would it be alright if I sang for you again outside of my duties? It's not often that I have an appreciative audience." Taken aback and not wanting to risk pissing off yet another neighbor, I said, "Sure." Some of her grief seemed to alleviate as I walked away. Her song continued, following me as I made my way back to the G6. I set the shirt on the floor so that it wouldn't get the seat wet. Everything clicked then. The shirt, the mechanic's absence, the G6 used to be my father's and the title is still in his name. Now rest assured, I haven't shared a last name with him since I was 6. Long story short, Mom grabbed me one day and took us off to hide at my grandma's house. After he came home from work and saw that we'd left him, he brought his gun to a Gulf gas station. Only one other person besides him survived, and she's paralyzed from the waist down. I don't want to say what other sickening things he did to her. There were some people, namely my sperm donor side of the family, who blamed my mom for the shooting, saying that if she'd just been a better wife, he wouldn't have killed all of those people or tortured that woman. They weren't the only ones either. How could she not have known he was like this? How could she raise a child with someone like that? And to this day, the way she was vilified doesn't make any sense to me. The harassment eventually got so bad that she and I had to change our names and move. Say what you will about Pittsburgh, but the good thing about it is that it's so big that no one has the time to worry about other people's histories. Life got better for us after that. So there you have it. That's my formative years summed up in 3 paragraphs. All to explain why my name is so far removed from my father's. My blood ran cold as I came to the realization that the mechanic had to have gone after my father. And good luck with that. He was all the way across the country in Supermax. They transferred him after he strangled one of his cellmates and then beat a corrections officer to death. Great guy, right? After I got home, I Googled my old name, wanting to be sure that the one that I've used for almost 30 years now wasn't associated with it. I got all the way to the 10th page and nothing came up. Well, it honestly probably helps that I don't have any social media that I can't be anonymous on. I also got some good advice from someone on Reddit to keep my identity hidden. In an extreme moment of paranoia, I even paid to have my information taken off those creepy websites that collect personal info without permission. Sleep was not happening after that. He couldn't reach my father, could he? The sperm donor was under constant surveillance on one of the most secure facilities in the country. There was no way even a wild huntsman would get him, right? Next morning, Mom called. She sounded strange from the moment she said,
"Hey, sweetie."
She had a bomb to drop on me. Father had an unexpected heart attack. They couldn't save him. He's dead. It's a heart attack. Something so simple. So regular. Mom muttered,
"We're finally free."
This may sound odd, but we laughed through our tears together. Emotionally, I was a mess. I was relieved that he was finally gone and terrified of what the mechanic could be up to, all topped off with a slight tinge of guilt for celebrating the death of another human being, even though I can comfortably say that the old man was pure evil. It was a lot. The mechanic didn't leave me waiting in suspense for long. 2 days after receiving that news, I dozed off on my couch watching a cheesy horror movie from the 80s that had something to do with energy vampires from space. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by someone pounding on my door. Squinting at the clock on my wall, I saw it was 3 a.m. My nighttime visitor pounded on the door again. Still not entirely awake, I groaned as I slowly slunk off the couch to look through the peephole, grumbling internally about how the crotchety old man next door was probably going to bitch at me in the morning. Halfway to the door, my hagstone quivered against my collarbone. That woke me up. I seized my shotgun, adrenaline warming my spine as the hagstone kept shaking. I glanced down to make sure that the salt line I placed in front of the door was still intact, and it was. Whatever was outside wouldn't be able to get in. And that's when I heard the last possible voice I'd ever expect to hear. "Fiona, please." Fuck. That was my father. Or it used to be. At that point, I wasn't sure. His voice was strained, shaking as if he were struggling to get the words out. He rasped, He won't let me die until you open the door. Please. Oh, fuck me. After swallowing back my nerves, I looked through the peephole. Even though I'd been ashamed to be related to him my entire life, when I saw what the mechanic had done to him, I had to hold back a scream as I recoiled away from the door. We looked so much alike, same mouth, same eyes. The mechanic had left all of the parts of my father that we shared with him. It was all too easy to imagine that it was me that had been mutilated instead, pieces cut off as I was reduced into sentient meat. The miserable thing on my doorstep pleaded again, wiping my eyes with the back of my forearm. I forced myself to turn the knob, shotgun in hand, with every intention of putting what used to be my father out of his misery. And it was even worse when I could see all of him. What was left of him, anyway? There were 2 short whistles from the parking lot. I glanced up to see that damned box blue Chevy truck parked beneath the only working light, and the mechanic leaning against the driver's side door. Even though his face was obscured by the shadows cast by his baseball cap, I was certain that he was loving every second of this. He whistled again as if he was calling a dog. What used to be my father stiffly shuffled on twisted limbs towards the mechanic, shaking and groaning with every movement. I didn't care if the old bastard next door or any of the other tenants complained as I took aim and blew a hole in the back of my father's misshapen skull. He dropped to the ground and then began to drag himself along as best he could. Both arms ended in stumps. For years I'd hated that man. Wished that literally any person on the planet would have been the one to provide the sperm that won. Some may argue that after what he'd done to so many other innocent people, he deserved to suffer like this, and before that night I would have agreed. However, it's something else entirely to see him crawling on his belly like a worm, mangled by something that somehow managed to be even more vicious than he was. I knew that I couldn't save him or even offer him the mercy of death. Whatever happened to him next was entirely at the mechanic's discretion. There was only one way I could think of to help him. Ignoring the nausea stirring in my gut, I crossed the salt line and picked my father up, gritting my teeth as he howled in agony after I accidentally put too much pressure on his exposed muscles. I carried him as close as the hagstone would allow without making the mechanic flinch, setting him down on the cracked pavement as gently as I possibly could. The amount of strength it took to remain polite was astronomical. He did what you wanted. Now please just let him die. The mechanic tilted his head, letting the light illuminate half of his handsome face as he narrowed his eyes at me. What, you don't like my new pet? He asked. God, he's the fucking worst. Before I could say anything else, the mechanic smiled as he said, You know, he and I talked for hours after he died. He was a right pain in the ass. It took me breaking out the pliers for him to remember just Fiona. Hell of a dad, right? Pretty name, by the way. Shame it ain't yours anymore. I'm running out of time. Please release him. Bound to your word. Alrighty, the mechanic said, grin still in place as he bent to drag my father towards him. When I saw the mechanic place his index finger in the corner of my father's eye, I quickly turned and darted towards my apartment, refusing to watch what was about to happen. Raina had been right. My father let out an animalistic shriek, sounding more like a trapped rabbit than a human. No one in the other apartments even woke up. Not a single light was turned on. And the next day, no one mentioned anything. Not even the cranky old geezer. Once I was inside, I locked my door and placed a second salt line across the threshold, and then I promptly went into the bathroom to puke my guts up. Yet another night without sleep. Even if the mechanic learns my name, I still have the hagstone. The night I'd made the bet had confirmed that he couldn't get into my head as long as I had it. As long as it's on me, he can't get near me. According to the terms of our deal, no matter what, if I figure out who he is, he has to release his claim on my soul and on Victor no matter what. We're not completely fucked yet. I still have time to get to that ledger. I can still beat him. In the meantime, I've discussed what happened with my coworkers. We all agreed that it was best for me to not be alone, so I'll be staying with Victor for a while. Even with his tie to the hunt, He was more experienced when it came to things like this than Reyna was. And the full moon was coming, and I swear that even if it's the last thing I do, I will learn that bastard's name.